tonight we are going to be talking all about Christmas cookies. So thank you everybody who shared your favorites in the chat. We'll be talking about some of the ones you mentioned as we get started. So the title of my talk is Koekje, Cookie or Cookie, A History of American Christmas Cookies. And yes, we're going to talk about those different spellings and where the term cookie comes from. But I thought we would start with a little bit of a background about, where cookies come from and how they come to be. So of course, the ancestors of cookies are unleavened hard breads, right, which date back to, Sumeria and the Fertile Crescent, and basically anyone who is growing grain and grinding it up is making unleavened bread. Around 700 CE, that's the Common Era, the Persians start adding sugar to unleavened breads. They had a trading partnership with India, which is where sugarcane is indigenous to. And so they were the first to bring sugar to the Mediterranean, to Europe, and they kind of continue that relationship as the centuries go on. But they're the first ones to kind of introduce it to what we think of now as cookies. So cookies start to become popularized in medieval Europe, largely through the Moorish invasion of Spain, right? So in the medieval period, we have the Crusades, we have Europeans going to the Holy Land and kind of discovering all of the science and medicine and mathematics and rediscovering a lot of the discoveries made by the Greeks and Romans, right, through the Arab empires. But then also when the Moors invade Spain, they bring a lot of foodways into Europe that get introduced that route. When they do that, a lot of the spices that are coming from the Arab Silk Road spice trade are also introduced to Europe. So we have ginger, black pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and then other ingredients like wine, almonds, honey, anise, and caraway. Those are the main kind of wealthy people ingredients that are being used to flavor all kinds of foods, including cookies, right? Those are the early medieval era ingredients. When we get to the 16th century or the 1500s, a lot of Europeans, notably the Dutch and English, were trying to kind of break away from the Portuguese and Spanish monopoly of the trade routes around the Horn of Africa. They were trying to kind of bypass some of the Arab trade routes. A lot of the spices coming overland on the Silk Road from like Indonesia, Southeast Asia, India, China, they were being routed through Venice, which is part of the reason why northern Italy is at the heart of the Renaissance, because all of this money, this very lucrative spice trade, was being funneled through Venice. So in the 16th century, the other European countries are like, hey, we want to figure out our own route. The Dutch in particular are pretty brutal in their takeover of the spice trade. If you want to know more about the kind of early jockeying around the spice trade, you can check out a book called Nathaniel's Nutmeg. It's very engagingly written. It's a history book, but it's not like an academic history book, so it's easier to read. And he goes a lot into the kind of crazy massacres and things that they do to get control of these tiny spice islands. A lot of these spices are really only indigenous to very small islands and locations. They eventually do get spread elsewhere, but in the beginning, nutmeg, for instance, and mace, which is part of the nutmeg plant, is only available on a tiny set of islands. So 16th century, we get nutmeg coming from the Spice Islands and cloves. Allspice is coming from the Caribbean. We also get things like vanilla. Sugar in particular explodes in production in the 16th and 17th centuries, in large part thanks to the Atlantic slave trade and the development of sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Previously, sugar had only been available through India and was therefore very expensive and not in wide use. But once we get sugar from the slave trade, then it gets a lot cheaper because obviously people are not paying for the labor to produce it. So cookies end up kind of representing wealth throughout a lot of this time period. We don't think of them as being a symbol of wealth today because they're just kind of ubiquitous, but really up until the 19th century, they were largely a symbol of wealth. So part of that is because of the ingredients, right? You have a lot of kind of scarce or difficult to produce ingredients, particularly ingredients that are difficult to find or scarce in the wintertime, like eggs and butter. And then there's also the difficulty in baking. If you don't have an oven, it's really hard to make cookies. And even if you do have an oven, the bake ovens of the past were not super easy to use and regulate. And then, of course, the association of cookies with Christmas has to do with the Christmas feasting that would happen around the holiday season. That's a time when people are saving a lot of, they save up their calories, right? You have your fast early in the season, so you can save up food for the feasts that are to come, usually like 12 days. The 12 days of Christmas is Christmas to 12th night. You were feasting and kind of relaxing that whole time. But also it's a time of year when people are kind of showing off their wealth. They want to impress their guests, right? They have a lot of guests. And so how do you show off your wealth through food? Cookies are one way you can do that. So I talked a little bit about the baking being difficult. Bake ovens, I have a picture in a minute, but I'll just explain quickly for those of you who don't know. Bake ovens are basically large masonry structures. You build a fire inside of it. It doesn't have a chimney. The fire actually comes out the front and goes up. And basically when you build a fire in it, you are preheating the oven. So once the oven gets hot enough, you rake out the coals, right? And then you're putting in foods in the succession of how hot they need to be cooked, what temperature they need to be cooked at, and also how long they need to be cooked. So you're probably going to start with things like bread, cookies, cakes, things that need to be cooked at a high temperature relatively quickly. And then, you know, the last thing usually that you would put in as the oven is cooling down is like a pot of beans, right? And that would cook overnight. In the medieval period in Europe, a lot of communities had community bake ovens, right? There was a village baker who would bake all the bread. And then if you didn't have an oven, and especially in Jewish and Christian communities, when you're not supposed to be cooking or working on the Sabbath, you would bring your food to the baker the night before. He would put it in the bake oven, shut the door, it would cook all night, and then you would come and get it the next day and you would have hot food that you didn't actually have to do any work for on the Sabbath. Cookie molds start to be a thing in the 15th century. We'll get into them a little bit more later, but I have an example here of a 19th century tin mold. Molds get super ubiquitous in the 19th century with advances in tin mining and also in tin manufacturing. Your sweeteners get a little more accessible as you go on. The 19th century, we talked about sugar and sugar plantations. Your tin baking sheets also get more affordable and ubiquitous as time goes on. And then there's also a skill to baking. Your average household, particularly in Europe and especially in the early United States, does not necessarily have access to a bake oven. So a lot of the cookie baking was relegated to wealthy households or to professional bakers. So this is an image of a medieval bake oven. It's not, you know, the perspective isn't great, but you can see it's this big giant masonry thing. There's a fire in the front. They've raked the coals out, right? And they're now putting bread in it. This one does not have a door, but typically the smaller ones where you're basically not making hundreds of loaves of bread. You would have a door and you would do it in succession. And they have this long peel. It looks just like a pizza peel to put the bread on the floor of the oven and take it back out when it's done. So we talked a little bit about cookie molds. They date back to the medieval period. Cookie cutters really start in the 15th century in Germany with gingerbread, which we'll get into in a bit. And then they become super popularized in the 19th century. And I just have this image here. This is a, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking. A patent, an image from a patent that was submitted by Alexander P. Ashburn, who was formerly enslaved, so he's African American, and it's for an industrial spring-loaded biscuit cutter. And as you may know, biscuit is also a term for cookie, right? We'll get into that etymology in a little bit. But that term was in use in the United States in the 19th century. So a lot of people have interpreted this to mean biscuit in the American Southern style biscuit sense, that he's, you know, making these for caterers or whatever to have shaped biscuits. I think it's actually for making cookies. And that is because if you are putting the dough here and you are flipping over the spring-loaded cutter and then flipping it back, if you are using biscuit, like fat biscuit dough, the dough is going to get stuck in those molds. And how do you get it out, right? Not super clear. They also, it's hard to tell from this image how deep the molds actually are, if they go all the way to the bottom. Maybe it was for biscuits, but here it looks like they're kind of flat. So I think it could be for cookies instead of biscuits. That's my personal theory. It doesn't really say in the patent application. It's one of those things where they assume everybody knows what you're talking about, and it's like, do we though? Not really. So we do also have the development of a cookie press, which is like for extruding dough, right? So that dates back to the 16th century in Germany, but it gets really popularized in the United States in the 1930s with Miro Aluminum Company's invention of the cookie gun, right? So if you have made S cookies or wreath cookies or spritz or anything like that, or like the little shaped cookies, if you have a cookie press, that was wildly popular, particularly in the 1950s, as you know, we get out of the Great Depression and World War II, and kind of butter and sugar rationing go by the wayside. Those cookies become hugely popular. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we talked a little bit about biscuit versus biscuit, right? So where does this terminology come from? Why do the Brits say biscuit and we say cookie? And it has everything to do with the foreign language that you are adopting, right? So French, biscuit, or biscuit or cuit means cooked, right? And bi means twice. So biscuit in French is twice cooked. It's also related to Italian biscotti, which means the exact same thing, but is actually twice cooked. Most biscuits in France and Britain are not twice cooked, but Italian biscotti definitely are. Ironically, in English, the word for biscotti, there is a word for biscotti in English, and it's rusk. Don't ask me where that comes from. So why do Americans say cookie? It's because, unlike the British, we did not get our terminology from the French. We got our terminology from the Dutch. And this may come as a surprise to some of you, but New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and Pennsylvania were once a Dutch colony known as New Netherland. Most of the settlements were settled on what is today New York, mainly Manhattan and Albany and the Hudson Valley, which is where I'm from. But the Dutch word for cookie is koekje, which means a small cake. So a koek, whatever, is a cake, and then the ye at the end is the diminutive. So koekje is a small cake. And that is where the term cookie comes from. Other languages do kind of also use this kind of small cake version. So like in Norwegian, it's small Koekje, which literally means small cakes. In Spanish, it's galleta, which does not mean small cake. In fact, etymologists don't really know where it comes from. It is related to the word for gallon, but people don't really know why it's called, why the Spanish call them galleta. And then the Germans call them Plätzchen, which technically means a little place, but it's also a derivative of Platz, meaning a flat round cake. So again, in German, Chen is a diminutive, so it's a little flat round cake, right? But because the Dutch gave us this name, that's why we call them cookies instead of small cakes, instead of biscuits. So the spelling also changes over time. So I have this fun little Google Ngram of all the different possible spellings, and I ended it in 1950 because if you go to the present, you can't even see these other spellings because the cookie with an IE is so dominant. So I limited it so you could kind of see that it's not, I mean, early 19th century, we don't really have standardized spelling. Cookie with an EE, having this spike in the in the late 18 teens could also be someone who cooks, right? But definitely cookie with a Y is really kind of given cookie with an IE a run for its money. It gets more popular in the 1910s. And again, this is not necessarily the vernacular, but this is how it's published in print materials, right? So this is what this is showing us. So it gets more popular in the 19-teens as cookie with a Y, and then cookie with an IE just kind of skyrockets and takes over, and that becomes the official spelling. So I talked a little bit about Dutch and New Netherland, right? So we have the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which becomes New York in 1664. They're actually a colony for a fairly short period of time, 1614 to 1664. But the Dutch heritage continues for much, much longer. Really until the 19th century, people are still speaking Dutch in the Hudson Valley in particular in New York. So that tells you how long those traditions linger. Some other Dutch words like slaw to mean a salad, that's a Dutch word that's made its way into our lexicon. So there are a couple others too. But again, we have Koekje. Cookies in Dutch culture were initially associated with funerals and New Year's Day, not necessarily Christmas. You might say cookies and funerals, what the heck are you talking about, Sarah? So this is a thing done in the early modern period that when you had a funeral, you would basically want to give people refreshments and also a souvenir. So people would make cookies as a souvenir of the funeral. It was a way to kind of show off your wealth. They're also pretty shelf stable and easy to serve, right? Much easier than cake. And then also with New Year's Day, the Dutch Reformed Church was a Protestant Calvinist church. That was the official religion of the Netherlands, although the Netherlands had a policy of toleration of other religions. So they didn't necessarily celebrate Christmas at this time, kind of like the Puritans. But one celebration that was kind of a holdover from when the Dutch were Catholic was St. Nicholas Day. And they just have the first print reference to cookie in there, which is quite early. And it's in relation to a funeral. So St. Nicholas Day is coming up, right? It's December 6th. And it's when St. Nicholas comes and visits all the children and leaves them gifts, including cookies, right? So it's kind of like the Dutch version of Christmas. And I have this great little illustration here from the 1850s of here's St. Nicholas delivering a giant speculoos cookie to this very happy surprised boy. It's not really gingerbread. There's no ginger in it. But if you've ever had Biscoff cookies, that's basically what speculoos is. It's like this crisp, sweet, not too crumbly, crunchy, brown sugar and cinnamon flavored cookie. They are one of my favorites. I have made them from scratch. It's a little finicky, but totally worth the effort if you're ever thinking of it. So that's really our ancestry of cookies, but also speculoos are the Dutch cookies that we most associate with Christmas today. So I said they're not gingerbread because they're not, but they are kind of related. Gingerbread is older than speculoos. It goes back to medieval Europe, particularly Germany. And I just have this little note here because one of my friends is also a food historian. His name is Neil DiMarino, and he has done a ton of research into gingerbread specifically. And he also collects these beautiful molds and recreates the historic recipes. And one of the historic recipes he recreated was the earliest one he could find, which is a 14th century gingerbread recipe, which is 1300s, right? It's basically, it's almost like a cake pop. It's breadcrumbs and ginger and honey, kind of made into these little balls, very intensely flavored. Not the greatest dessert, I would say, compared to what we have today, but maybe that was revolutionary in the 14th century. Very strongly flavored, very sweet because of the honey, and just kind of an interesting texture, right? It's almost got like a cake poppy type texture because of that. Black pepper was also a main ingredient in a lot of gingerbread recipes, particularly in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. And so you see this reflected in some of the pepper related cookies. So you have pfeffernusse, even though pfeffernusse doesn't necessarily have black pepper in it. Pepperkakor, which are Swedish gingerbread cookies that definitely have a lot of black pepper in them. And then we get kind of gingerbread migrating to England, right? And Queen Elizabeth kind of popularizes it. She hosts a feast and has gingerbread men. It's really the first reference to gingerbread men. She has molds like this one carved in the likeness of some of her guests, and then has them make gingerbread in these molds and then gives it out at the party. So imagine going to a party and you get there and there's a cookie of your face. That's kind of what this was like. So that's really the first reference to gingerbread men and gingerbread being made into figures. So this is a mold from the 1750s, right? So about 100 years later. And as the molds got more intricate, the figures became more popular. You do also see throughout Europe from the medieval period right up to the 19th and even 20th century, gingerbread being very popular retail item, right? So bakers are making gingerbread to sell to locals. So this is just a beautiful little image of a stall at a church fair. And this is all the gingerbread that's on display. And you can see they have these big hearts and they have like candied fruit in the middle, green tinted candied fruit. People would give certain shapes of gingerbread, had like different meanings. Like for instance, if you were a girl who was trying to find a husband, you might eat a gingerbread man, right? Or if you wanted to express romantic love for someone, you might give them a gingerbread heart, right? There were all kinds of little traditions around gingerbread at this time of year. So the British traditions, even though the British helped popularize gingerbread men, the Brits don't have a ton of cookie traditions. They have their Christmas pudding, which they put together on Stir About Sunday. I always forget what the date of Stir About Sunday is. I think it has already passed. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Mincemeat pies are super popular in Britain still to this day. Obviously, the ubiquitous fruit cake. And then to a lesser extent, gingerbread. That along with shortbread are like their only two real Christmas cookies that, you know, date back before the 20th century. Christmas, as we know it today, was really popularized by Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert. So before the Victorian period, nobody except for German immigrants had Christmas trees in England or the United States. So if you go to like a colonial house and you see a Christmas tree, that's inaccurate. They didn't have those unless it was a German immigrant, right? But Prince Albert brings the Christmas tree tradition to the UK and really helps popularize it there and in the United States, and really from there kind of around the world. So this is just a cute little postcard of Stir About Sunday. There was a big thing in the late 19th century in England and the United States of going back to kind of like Elizabethan times, Shakespearean times, merry old England kind of stuff. So you see that reflected in the title, Ye Merry Christmas Time, ye family stood about. They've got the kind of faux Middle English, Old English spelling there. And basically they are stirring up all the fruit and the pudding to get it to age in the brandy before you're going to steam it to make your Christmas pudding. And so there's a lot of lore around this. Each family member has to, stir it once, and then you make a wish and all kinds of fun stuff. So obviously they're just doing the stirring. Who's doing the cooking? Yeah, the servants, not them, right? So this is clearly a wealthier household. So I also mentioned shortbread. Shortbread is not English. It is Scottish, right? So Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain. Shortbread dates back to the 12th century, but it's really not popularized until the 17th century, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is that Scotland in the 16th century was in a prolonged economic depression. They'd been really hard hit by the plague. So in the 17th century, things were kind of starting to recover. They had a trade agreement with England, so they had access to English markets. Scotland is very well suited to raising cattle, so that they had a huge dairy cattle market, which meant lots of access to butter. And then with access to the English markets, they had more access to wheat flour and sugar. And that's what gives us shortbread. Mary Queen of Scots apparently loved shortbread, so she helps popularize it. And then also Queen Victoria, who has her own Scottish obsession with Balmoral, right, the Scottish estate of the royal family. She popularizes tartan and all kinds of other things, but shortbread is definitely up there. And then if you're a fan of Martha Stewart also had a very big shortbread phase in the 90s and early 2000s, where she collected all these heritage molds. So in addition to gingerbread being made in molds, we also have shortbread molds. And this is a very classic Scottish one where it's got the thistle and you cut it into triangles, right? So it's kind of pre-scored in the mold for you to cut it into triangles. So cookies in the United States are a little bit different than they are elsewhere in the world. Not quite the same as England, not quite the same as other European countries. So why is that? Well, one of them is that the ordinary person in the United States who was not enslaved had way more access to wealth and resources than the average free person in Europe, right? So the United States, there's much more access for ordinary people to own their own land. There's much more access to natural resources, right? Because they hadn't been overused like they had in Europe. We also have a lot more access to labor, particularly slave labor. So slavery was legal and prevalent in all of the 13 colonies, and it's really not abolished in a lot of those colonies until the early 19th century, and then of course in the South until after the American Civil War. But because we have this prevalence of slavery, not only do we have really cheap sugar, we also have other cheaper ingredients, and then a lot of household and kitchen labor that makes it much easier for people to have fancy food because they don't have to pay the person who is making it for them, right? You do also get the rise in the 19th century as we're getting more and more urbanized, as cities are growing, as people are kind of moving out of the countryside and away from producing their own food. We get a rise of professional caterers and bakers. So that's what this guy is doing. This is a professional baker. You can see there's like people outside. He's got his lineup of things that are going to go into the bake oven. You can see this is a newer version. There's a cast iron oven. There's a door, right? And so he's got this long peel and he's putting stuff in. There's more peels up here. There's the brush for brushing it out. He's able to put stuff in based on the time it needs to cook. No cookies in this image, sadly, but that's the kind of thing that professional bakers would be making. And then, of course, we also have a lot of immigration from various areas of Europe that are all bringing their own Christmas traditions. And a lot of them are kind of, you know, creating immigrant communities, right, where there's German and Irish and Italian and Scandinavian kind of insular communities where more immigrants are going there because there's people whose language they know and traditions they know. But also, as those immigrant communities, what's the word I'm looking for? As they assimilate, they start to disseminate some of their traditions to groups outside of their cultural group. And that happens for sure in the United States around Christmas. So just a quick overview of the types of immigration and the types of groups that we're getting coming to the United States and the colonies in the different time periods. So the 17th and 18th centuries, it's a lot of European immigrants, particularly those fleeing religious persecution. So we get a lot of Protestants. So there's Moravians, French Huguenots, Belgian Walloons, Palatine Germans. We do also get some Jews escaping the Spanish Inquisition. And then, of course, English, Dutch, Spanish, Scottish, to a lesser extent, French, Portuguese, but they're mostly from Northern Europe and kind of like the more dominant empires. In the early 19th century, we get a huge influx of German and Irish immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants with the potato famine. In the late 19th century, we start to get more Scandinavians, Italians, right, as we move toward Italian unification, Bohemians, as Germany moves toward unification. We get a number of people coming out of the Middle East, as there's a number of economic depressions in the Middle East. Eastern Europe, especially Jews escaping pogroms, and then also a lot of Chinese are coming to the West Coast to work on railroads and in San Francisco and things like that. The early 20th century, again, we're getting Russians, many of them escaping the Russian Revolution. We're getting more Eastern Europeans, Greeks, Lebanese, Syrians, and then also more Japanese, at least until World War II. So this is kind of the waves of immigration, and most of these people are having an influence on how Americans celebrate Christmas. So we'll start with the Moravians, who are one of the oldest groups. The Moravian Church was founded in the Czech Republic. It actually, it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, Protestant religion. It actually predates Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And they are the first Protestants to send missionaries out into the world. Obviously, there had been Catholic missionaries for a long time before this, but they're the first Protestant group to do that. In 1740, they start a mission with the Mohican people in Dutchess County, New York, which is like right across the river from me, so not too far away. They get expelled by the British in 1744 by the New York authorities because they think they are like fomenting native rebellion during the French and Indian War. And they end up in Pennsylvania, which, you know, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is now like Christmas capital of the world, right? So they bring a ton of Christmas traditions with them, including the Moravian Star, but in addition, cookies. They also settle in the Carolinas too. There's a large group of Moravians that end up settling down there. So they are famous for spice cookies, molasses cookies, and sugar cookies. I think we can potentially trace the American sugar cookie to the Moravian sugar cookies. They're really one of the first groups to make that style of cookie. That's not a shortbread, right? It's not a pastry. It's a sugar-based cookie. Similar to the French pâté sablé, but not exactly. The Germans have a huge influence on our Christmas traditions, largely through Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, but also from our German immigrants. And a lot of their cookies get intimately associated with Christmas. So I have the most historical information on these cookies, so I'm just gonna give a little background for each one. So we have Lebkuchen, dates back to the 13th century. It's invented in Ulm, Germany, and I have some recipes we'll go through in a minute. Springerle is 14th century Swabian, or that's the 1300s, right? Zinnsterne, which I had not heard of until I started doing Christmas cookie research, but which sound amazing, are 17th century. Pfeffernusse are 1750s, which is much later than I thought. And then also we have our Palatine German immigrants coming as early as the 17th century to the Americas, largely to New York under Queen Anne. They get some help coming over, mostly to make pine pitch for the British Navy in the Hudson Valley, but the type of pine trees in the Hudson Valley are not pitch pines. That didn't really work out. But they just move elsewhere. So they bring a lot of their Christmas traditions too. And then of course we also have the Pennsylvania Deutsch, right? Who for most of the 19th and 20th century, I think people called them Dutch, right? They've got like wooden shoes and tulips, but they're not actually Dutch from Holland. They are Deutsch, right? They speak German. Although the Netherlands did end up harboring a lot of these kind of religious dissidents before they came to the Americas, including the Pilgrims. We just came out of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims were separatists from the Anglican Church, and they stayed for over a decade in the Netherlands before they came to Massachusetts. So just a fun little fact there. And then, of course, like I said, Victoria and Albert helped popularize a lot of these traditions. So this is a fun early 20th century postcard, German postcard that's got a lot of the treats. So we've got some gingerbread with candied fruit in it. We've got some gingerbread with chocolate frosting. We've got fruit and nuts, right? Some of our traditional holiday foods. And then over here, we have some fruit cakes. So I just thought it was a nice illustration of all the yummy treats we associate with Christmas. So just to go over a little bit about each of the individual cookie. This is a 1909 recipe from American Cookery, which is also known as the Boston Cooking School magazine. I like to include it because here is a German recipe in an American magazine, and it's got this beautiful image. So these are what Springerle look like. They're made with these molds, right? Kind of similar to gingerbread molds, but more shallow, and they're usually scored. So you can cut them into squares. Springerle are very white. They're usually flavored with lemon, right? We have lemon zest in them. And then you kind of let them rest on aniseed, right? Before you cook them. So they're lemon and anise flavored. This is another simpler recipe. Again, it's sugar, lemon, and anise. So not necessarily maybe what we might associate with Christmas today, but definitely that was very popular flavor at the time, and it still is in a lot of German immigrant communities. This is a more modern example of some of the more elaborate Springerle molds you can see today, and you can see how very white they are. That's because of the egg whites and the sugar, and because there's no spices or brown sugar or molasses in them. Lebkuchen are a type of gingerbread that's usually flavored with citron. This is a very simple one. This is Lebkuchen number 1, right? So it's just cinnamon and citron and almonds. This is number 2, which is much more complicated. It has all different kinds of spices, brown sugar and molasses. It's got orange peel, citron, almonds, and chocolate, right? So they're frosted in a very fancy way, depending. These are commercially available Lebkuchen. These are modern ones, but these are the sorts of ones that you would buy from a professional bakery. And then also that, you might give away or might eat with maybe a specific reason in mind why you're eating a gingerbread man or a heart, right? Pfeffernusse, I love this one because it is a very distinctly American version of Pfeffernusse, right? Because it's got corn syrup and New Orleans molasses, right, in addition. So this one the spice is coming from cinnamon and cloves. This also has citron and almonds and lemon, but it says the almonds and citron may be omitted, right, if you can't have them or don't like them. Zinstar, now this is from my Joy of Cooking, my 1930s, I think, Joy of Cooking, no, 40s Joy of Cooking. And I like this one because I wasn't familiar with it until I started doing research for this talk, but it is naturally gluten-free, right? So it's just egg whites and sugar, cinnamon and lemon. The Germans love putting lemon in their Christmas cookies, and almonds, right? Just ground almonds. So they're traditionally cut into star shapes. They're brown from the cinnamon, but they make just really beautiful little gluten-free cookies if we're looking for a gluten-free cookie. Not quite as finicky as French macaroons, but very similar. And I like it says at the end, this recipe requires no flour. So our other maybe biggest influencer in terms of Christmas cookies is the Italians, right? I couldn't find much on dates for these cookies, so I apologize for that. But one of the most famous is pizzelles, which are pressed wafers that are very crisp. They're not usually too highly flavored, maybe a little almond or vanilla flavoring, but you know, they're a little bit thick for compared to other pressed cookies, which we'll talk about in a minute. But they're one of the more famous ones. Biscotti, obviously, we talked about that earlier. Amaretti, these are my favorite. They're like a chewy almond cookie. Agnetti, this is another one that was new to me, but it's apparently huge in Italian immigrant communities as a Christmas cookie, which is an anise flavored cookie. It's a little bit softer, and it's usually frosted, often with sprinkles on top. Strafoli are not actually a cookie, but they're just super interesting, so I thought I'd include them. They're little teeny fried balls of dough that are then kind of stuck together in clumps with honey. Which sounds just delicious. I would totally eat that. I've never had them. And then my favorite Italian cookie is the tricolore, or rainbow cookies, which are ubiquitous here in New York. They have a super interesting backstory. So they are developed in the United States, not actually in Italy, in the United States in the 1870s to show support for Italian unification. Right, so Italy prior to the 1870s was a whole bunch of separate provinces and city-states, right? It was not a unified country like it is today. So the tricolore is to represent the three colors of the Italian flag, green, red, and white. And they would tint the three layers of cookies in those colors. It became so popular that Jewish delis in New York City started adopting that cookie and making it. And then they called them rainbow cookies instead of tricolore. Because then after Italian unification, you don't need to support the Italian flag anymore. So people start doing other colors. But it's almond sponge layered with apricot and raspberry jam. And then they're like these long logs that are dipped in chocolate and then sliced. So you get the rainbow effect across. There are some really terrible rainbow cookies out there, but if you find really good ones, they're amazing. They're a little bit similar to petit fours, if you've ever had a petit four, but I think they are way better than petit fours. So just some fun. This is one of the few images I could find, biscotti, you know, just to get everybody on the same page. The next group is near and dear to my heart. I am 100% Scandinavian, so I grew up with pretty much all of these cookies. Pepparkakor being one of the oldest. That is the Swedish pepper cakes. It is spiced with black pepper. It's a type of gingerbread. They are rolled very thin. My grandmother used to make them every year for Christmas, and she would roll hers so thin they would almost break when you pick them up. But they're traditionally cut into heart or star shapes, sometimes circles. Like if you've ever had Anna's ginger cookies, that's kind of what pepparkakor are, only the homemade are way, way better. But there was like, if you got a heart-shaped one of the traditions in my family was if you pressed in the middle and it broke into 3 equal pieces, you could make a wish. So all kinds of fun traditions associated with Christmas cookies, right? Spritz, also huge in the Scandinavian community. Some people think it might be German because spritz is a German word that means to squirt. And also there's some evidence that the earliest cookie presses originated in Germany, but definitely they get introduced to the United States via the Scandinavians. It's a very rich, very buttery, very tender, crisp cookie that you need a cookie press for. So if you've ever had a wreath cookie or an S cookie, you've had spritz. Fatiman are sometimes also known as the poor man's cookie, and they are deep fried, which is very interesting. They're also, they're like cut into little rectangles and then a slit in the middle, and then you flip one side through it. So there's like kind of a twist in the middle, and then they're deep fried. They're usually spiced with nutmeg. Koekje are pictured here, very similar to pizzelles, although usually much thinner. And they are almost always rolled, right? Sometimes you'll see the straight rolled ones. That's people who don't have the special cone roller, or if you grew up and like, you know, your grandma rolled them around a broom handle or something like that. You'll sometimes see them straight, but the cone shape is more popular. Again, similar to pizzelles, and then also to Dutch waffler, right? Which was a cast, if you've ever seen Dutch cast iron waffle irons, they're not like waffle irons today. They are very thin, and they usually have little filigree impressions on them, much like the pizzelles and the koekje. And then sandbakkelse, one is a sandbakkel, more than one is sandbakkelse. Those are probably the most recent of the Scandinavian cookies. They date to the 1850s, and they have special tins to make them in. So I'll show you some pictures in just a minute. So pepperkaker, I have a couple of recipes. I found this great cookbook from North Dakota in the 1920s that had all kinds of immigrant recipes in it, but they had a ton of Scandinavian cookie recipes. So I just clipped a couple of them to share. So I like this one for not only the title, they have like phonetically spelled pepperkaker, right, instead of pepperkaker. And I love, this is a big recipe, but cookies will keep and improve the older they get, right? And it doesn't even tell you what to do. It just has the listing of ingredients, including a gallon of flour, but we see that black pepper is in there. So it doesn't tell you what to do. It just has a list of ingredients, which is very typical of recipes from this time period. We have a couple of recipes for spritz. Again, German or Scandinavian, ultimately doesn't matter. The Scandinavians are the ones who are introducing it to the Americas. There is a huge revival of spritz in the 1950s. You know, often with more anglicized names like S cookies or wreath cookies or butter wreaths, things like that. But it's very straightforward. It's just butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and a little bit of baking powder. Yeah, this says mix and press through a spritz cookie tube, right? A cookie press. Shape in wreaths. There were a million sandbakkelse recipes in this cookbook, so I thought I would share them all, in part because they are all attributed to like the three major groups. There's Norwegian, there's Swedish, there's more on this page, and then you also see the English, the anglicized version of sand tarts, right? So again, it's just butter, sometimes lard, right, if butter is a little scarce. It's butter, egg, sugar, and flour, and you're putting them in these little tins, which I will show you a picture of momentarily. That's what they look like. So they have all different kinds, right? The circular one being one of the more popular ones, or they have like one that just looks like a little tart tin, right? They're normally not filled with anything, but if you fill them with jam and with cream, you will be very happy. So I recommend. Fatiman, I kind of find a good picture of this, but they're interesting. They are not made with butter. They're made with cream usually. So cream, and then some of them call for pastry flour instead of just regular all-purpose flour, and you fry them. Koekje, again, it's attributed to multiple of the Scandinavian countries. We have Swedish, Denmark, and Norway. And they're talking. This one, I love this one. Use Koekje iron to bake. It doesn't even tell you what to do, right? It doesn't even have flour on this list. So you're just kind of supposed to know how to do it, I guess, but typical of the time period. And I also like this one. These cookies resemble ice cream cones, but are served as an ordinary cookie, right? So you're not filling them with anything usually. And then this one also references rolling them around a broom handle instead of a cone shape. So that brings us to our distinctly American cookies, right? And I have this great image here from, sorry, my doc is covering it up. Okay, it's from Click Americana, but I think it's from probably the Betty Crocker cookie book or something similar. So it's got all the hallmarks, right? We've got gingerbread men, we've got snowballs or Russian tea cakes, we've got sugar cookies that are frosted, we've got different shapes. This looks like a cherry cookie. We've got things that are shaped like wreaths. We've got little almond cookies. This looks like a macaroon. All the different kinds, little fruit cake bites here. So what makes distinctly American cookies, right? I'm not going to go too much into all of them, but I thought I would highlight some of the more popular ones, including peanut butter blossom, which is those peanut butter cookies with the chocolate kiss on top. Mexican wedding cakes, Mexican wedding cookies, Russian tea cakes, we'll get into those. And then cutout cookies. So obviously we have gingerbread men and other shaped cookies that are traditional in Europe, star-shaped Zimsterne, we have star heart-shaped peppercocker, things like that. But the shapes of like things seems to be a kind of more distinctly American thing, right? That we have like angels and trees and reindeer and stuff other than just gingerbread men and stars and hearts. And then of course the ubiquitous frosted sugar cookie. You do see royal icing on a lot of gingerbread in European countries, but the buttercream frosting is distinctly American. The tinted royal icing, the flooded royal icing cookies seems to be more of an American thing. And then of course, all the colored sugar and sprinkles. Other traditional Christmas cookie decorations besides just the white royal icing are, nuts or dried fruit or things like that. We're all about tinted sugar, sprinkles, red hots, other things besides candied fruit and nuts. So here's our little backstories about some of our more popular cookies. So the peanut butter blossom is the most recent, right? So we have the best backstory for this. So this was entered into the 1957 Pillsbury Bake Off, right? Pillsbury Flour Company started the Bake Off in the 1940s. And then it was so popular that they made it an annual thing, and they had all kinds of cookbooks and stuff published. It was submitted by Mrs. Chester Smith from Ohio, and it was not the Grand National winner, even though it says Grand National. She's the Grand National winner of the senior category. The actual Grand National winner there was a very forgettable, like butter almond flavored accordion shaped cookie. Nothing like this. This one was super popular in the cookbooks. It becomes so popular that Hershey's starts printing it on their Hershey's Kiss bags, and then it just completely takes off. I think in large part because A, it's chocolate and peanut butter, which is very American, and Americans love that flavor, and B, because it's so easy. You're just making a simple peanut butter cookie, and when it comes hot out of the oven, you're sticking a chocolate kiss in it, and it's just easy as pie. So it kind of takes over holiday cookie plates. It's super popular with kids and adults. And by the time we get to the 1960s, the end of the 1960s into the 1970s, it's just everywhere. Nowadays, you get the million variations where, they're using the Hershey's Hugs or like the peppermint flavored ones on a chocolate cookie. The ease with which you can make these cookies has just spawned a million iterations, but the peanut butter blossoms are the originals. Then there's that one cookie with a million different names. This seems to be one of the few like truly universal cookies. You see it just about everywhere. So this is our crumbly nut ball-shaped cookie that's rolled in powdered sugar. The origin is probably Middle Eastern. Rolled cookies, round cookies rolled in powdered sugar are very popular there. There is a date-filled one called mamoul, which is probably related to this particular cookie with many names. It was probably originally made with almonds or walnuts. And then from Moorish Spain, it makes its way to Mexico, which is where pecans are native. So if you know the pecan version, pecans are native to Mexico and the southern United States. So that's why they're called Mexican wedding cakes. You do see them used a lot in Mexico. The name Russian tea cakes, I searched and searched. I could not figure out where the heck that comes from. There are very few references to that terminology in any of the published places I could find. I'm guessing probably some Russian tea room made them and people just started calling them Russian tea cakes for that reason. The Mexican wedding cake name starts to take off during the McCarthy era when we didn't want to associate anything with Russia. That's also when you start to get the name snowballs, right? And their association with Christmas. So that's kind of a more anglicized, Americanized Christmassy name. So you see that too. They are related to pecan sandies, right? Which are very similar, crumbly, buttery, nut-rich cookie, but are not rolled in powdered sugar. So they have a million names, but they're delicious and messy, regardless of how they're called. We also have our distinctly American tradition of leaving milk and cookies for Santa. So leaving trees for magical visitors is a big thing in Christmas lore around the world, but we're probably the only ones who actually leave milk and cookies. So in Norway, the Nisse, which is like the little house elf that helps you all year round, at Christmas they get rummegröt, which is a really rich, delicious cream-based porridge. In Sweden, the tomte, who is the Swedish version of the Nisse, they get rice pudding instead of rummegröt. In Britain, Santa gets sherry, which I think British parents just made that up so they could have sherry after all the kids went to bed. In Germany, kids leave their letters to Santa on Christmas Eve out for Santa. So kind of like, that's a bold move, parents. How do you know what your kids want for Christmas if you're letting them write their letters on Christmas Eve? But that's what they do. In the Netherlands, they leave out carrots and hay for Sinterklaas's donkey, right? So they put them in their shoes, just like we get treats in our stockings, they get treats in their shoes. And so some people will also leave stuff out like for the reindeer in the United States, but in the Netherlands, they leave it out for the donkey. And so why do we leave out cookies and milk in general, right? So there's some theories that the American tradition dates back to the time when people would be traveling. Winter was way easier to travel for, the northern half of the United States, which for a long time was where the bulk of the population resided. So before we have decent roads, wintertime means much easier overland travel via sleigh. And also a lot of times when the rivers would freeze, they would basically become roads, right, for sleighs and easier to travel. But this is also a time period when, hotels and taverns and places to stay are not really a thing. So the theory is that particularly around the holiday season, you would leave a fire going and you would leave food out in case any, weary travelers happened upon your door, they could help themselves without waking you up. So that's one of the theories as to why we leave out cookies and milk for Santa. One of the earliest print references to that tradition in the United States is from the 1870s. And it's a couple of little girls expressing skepticism that it's actually Santa who eats the cookies and drinks the milk. So that tells you it's a much older tradition, but that was the first print reference I could find. So why do cookies become a tradition at all, right? We talked a little bit about how they were the purview of the wealthy and how kind of the scarcity around the ingredients made them popular at Christmas time. But we don't really have that in the United States. But we do have some things that make them much more accessible and more ubiquitous. So one of those is changes in American agriculture. We get giant farms, we get farm machinery that makes it much easier to harvest wheat, makes it much easier to process sugar. We get the development of plantations growing spices outside of their original islands, right? So the prevalence of spices makes spices much more affordable. We have the chemical advantage. So I have this really sweet little advertisement from Royal Baking Powder, and there are these little gingerbread people right around this adorable sleeping child. It says Royal Baking Powder makes the best gingerbread cookies, cakes, and biscuits, right? So the United States is one of the earliest adopters of chemical leaveners. One of the first is one called pearl ash, which is a derivative of potash or potash, which I learned quite recently. Albany, New York was a major headquarters of potash and pearl ash production, which is one of the reasons why the first American cookbook, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons, calls for it, because she was probably from the Hudson Valley. The second edition of her book was published in Albany. We also have hartshorn or baker's ammonia. Some of you who maybe are into old-fashioned cookie recipes know that some of those cookie recipes still call for baker's ammonia. Very, very stinky, but it bakes off. Hartshorn is also one of the main ingredients in smelling salts. If you ever read like historic novels and you know someone's got smelling salts, they're having hartshorn waved under their nose to wake them up. Baking soda, obviously we still use that today. That's a really great leavener when you combine it with an acid. And baking powder allows us to not have to mix baking soda with an acid. It's a mix of baking soda and cream of tartar, right? And it's just a much less aggressive but more reliable leavener than baking soda. We also get advances in kitchen technology, where we get stoves. We don't have to have bake ovens and open hearths anymore. We get the development of cast iron stoves. We get ice boxes and then refrigerators, which gives rise to ice box cookies and slice and bake cookies. So this is just an example of a kitchen from probably about the 1840s, judging by the women's clothing. Very primitive compared to today's. You can see there's no running water, and they just have an open hearth. There is no bake oven in this kitchen. There's a tin kitchen, which is what this is. That's for spit roasting meats, but there's no bake oven. So what are we making? We're making a pie, because that is easy to make in a Dutch oven and cook on an open hearth, which is another reason why American style pie becomes so popular and ubiquitous throughout the country, because it's very easy to make in kind of primitive conditions. This is a little bit later. This is from the 1870s. So here we have this beautiful cast iron stove, but not super clear where the oven is on this one. Might be here, but most of our cooking we're still doing on the stovetop. We do actually have hot water though, which is great, and some running water. And we're still making pie. So we talked about cookies, and kind of how we got here and how they got to be so ubiquitous in the United States, but how did they become a Christmas tradition, right? Well, part of it is we have those immigrant traditions that we're holding on to, but another part is that they really get popularized in the 20th century, in large part because during World War II, the federal government encouraged people to send boxes of Christmas cookies to the troops overseas. World War II was the great homogenizer in a lot of ways. We had already been on this trend of a more homogenous, kind of universally American foodways, which PS is actually like Yankee New England foodways, but you know, they start to become more accessible across the country, and we're kind of losing a lot of our regional differences. And so the idea of Christmas cookies is kind of popularized at that time. In the 50s and 60s, we get a number of Christmas cookbooks published. And then, of course, also Betty Crocker's cookie book, right? Cookies are easier than ever to make. We have electric ovens, which are the best for baking because it's even regulated heat. We have refrigerators so we can chill dough. We have electric mixers, choppers, things like that, that make cookie baking so much easier than it was historically. So what's the future of cookies? Maybe it's a little bleak these days. We've got all these different diets that are maybe restricting people's consumption of white flour and sugar, right? Store-bought cookies are ubiquitous. Cookies are no longer the purview of the wealthy, right? You can get cookies anytime, day or night. More and more people are making like artisan style cookies. There are people who have like built whole businesses just on making fancy, mostly highly decorated royal icing kind of cookies. Cookie slops were super popular, but in recent decades have kind of fallen out of favor. There's lots of complaints of people who put a ton of time and effort into making homemade cookies, and then they go to cookie slop and it's like the slice and bake cookie dough from the store, or somebody did store-bought cookies. And so there's kind of this imbalance of wanting to preserve traditions and do it the hard way, and people who are just pressed for time, right? There's also diet culture and the whole idea that we shouldn't be eating rich foods at feasting times of year, which I totally disagree with. And then people are rejecting traditions that don't suit them, right? That don't meet their needs, that they think might be too hard, or that they don't want to continue. So the future of Christmas cookies is up in the air. We definitely all like to eat them, unless we're on a diet, I guess. But whether or not they continue remains to be seen. So that's my talk. Does anybody have any questions? I didn't see any pop up in the chat.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was great.
Yeah,
really
thanks for having me.
Yeah.
We can give people a second if they want to ask some questions in the chat. Sorry, I went a little bit over time there.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so somebody says, my 1908 White House cookbook has almost 600 pages, but only 8 cookie recipes in the cake chapter. Yeah, yep. It's interesting. You see them around, but cakes are definitely way more popular at the turn of the 20th century than cookies are. Cookies exist, and there are, some more heritage cookies, like Joe Frogger's and molasses cookies and oatmeal cookies and things like that. But it's really not until the 20th century that you get the proliferation of a lot of what we consider modern American style cookies. Oh, what is considered a hot oven and a moderate oven? Yes, so those terminologies date back to the time period when you didn't have any controls on your oven because you're just putting wood or coal into it. So you kind of had to go by feel. So a hot oven is generally like 475, like 450 to 500, right? A moderate oven is our classic like 350, right? 350 to 375, and a slow oven is usually 325 or cooler, right? And that is basically slow being how quickly your fire is burning often. Hot obviously being, or sometimes you'll see hot oven referred to as a quick oven, right? Because you're burning fire very quickly. And then moderate oven, we love those recipes because that's just our favorite 350 temperature. Oh, Carolyn says, did they use whole wheat flour before there was white flour in the early recipes? So if you see recipes that call for sifting flour, especially if you're sifting it multiple times, that is usually to remove any remaining wheat germ that might be present in your flour. It's also to kind of fluff it up so that it's not so packed down. But yeah, so by the time we get to like the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s, commercially available flour is bolted, which means basically it is sifted through fabric. So it is removing most or all of the wheat germ and the bran, which is part of what makes it shelf stable, because wheat germ and wheat bran contain oil, right? They have fat in them. And so that can go stale very quickly. But if white flour is available really prior to the American Civil War, but especially after the American Civil War, as we get some innovations in our rollers. We get steel and ceramic rollers instead of stone grist mills. And then also in our agricultural development. So you get the development of different styles of wheat flour. So for instance, the South often does not have a lot of yeasted bread recipes because Southern wheat is a soft wheat, which is lower gluten. So that's why a lot of Southern recipes call for cake flour or pastry flour or soft wheat flour. That's because that's the style of flour that was available primarily in the South. In the North, you get like winter wheat and hard red wheat and things like that that are much higher gluten content. Today, it's all kind of the same, right? Unless you're getting something very specific. But yeah, I think that's also part of the reason why a lot of those early cookie recipes are kind of heavy on the spices and molasses. Because it's difficult to get that very, very fine white texture unless you have white flour, access to white flour. But you could always sift it yourself. So great question, though. Any other questions? Yeah, making cookies from scratch, not as hard as it seems. It takes a lot of butter. Depending on your recipe, but definitely it is doable. The hardest thing with historic recipes is that they often make so many, so it doesn't actually take that long to make the dough, but then you're baking for like hours because you're making like 5 dozen or whatever the recipe calls for. Oh yes, if you haven't, your German mother's springerly rolling pin, oh my gosh, you should try using it at least once just to try it. I have to, I'm always so busy around Christmas time. I made Sonnenbachels for the first time earlier this year. I actually made them for Scandinavian Midsummer, not for Christmas, but I do have my Sonnenbachel tins. They were so easy. If you make Sonnenbachels, let them cool in the tin, otherwise you'll never get them out. And I do have a Koekje iron, so I feel like I should try making Koekje. I have made spritz. I have not tried pepperkake or Koekje. But yeah, if you have those traditions, let's try them, right? Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad you guys had a good time. Great. All right, well, if anybody thinks of any other questions, my contact information is right there. You can always track me down. My email address is sarah@thefoodhistorian.com. So, and if you want to send this talk to somebody else, I'm doing it a bunch more times in December. So I've got my calendar up on my website with the other talks that I'm doing. So you're welcome to check it out.
Well, thanks, Sarah, so much. And I'm going to put this talk up on the Waterford Library YouTube page. And I encourage everyone to go to thefoodhistorian.com.
Great. Thanks for asking such good questions and being good participants, everyone. I always love that. So,
Sarah, thank you very much. Very informative.
Great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Anybody else want to unmute and share a question or personal anecdote? No? Well.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I guess we'll end for the night.
There go my dogs. So. They were so good and quiet, and now they're getting barky. So anyway. All right. Thanks for joining us,
Okay.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Sarah.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.